All right, so the first thing I want you to notice on our table here is the rule book. So we have 4 different kinds of service that we're allowed to perform. We can perform an examination. Again, that's similar to basically the same for all intents and purposes as an audit. We can do a review, we can do a compilation, or we can be engaged to perform agreed upon procedures. Now, the reason we want to draw those distinctions is in part because of the standards that then support each of those services. You'll notice that the attest standards are valid for examination, for review, and agreed upon procedures. However, when it comes to compilations within this standard, these are going to fall under the SARS. That's the accounting and review standard. So even though we're dealing with things outside of historical financial statements, the SARS do still apply. Now with that, we're going to look at 5 different types of engagements. So I'll just number them here just so we can keep them straight. So we have 5 different types. If you want to say 5 different subject matters that we can be asked to perform different attestation services upon. The first is prospective financial statements. Again, that's forward-looking financial statements, forecasts, and projections. So let's go down the line. We're going to deal with each service and then talk about whether or not we can perform the different level of services offered. Now, starting with an examination, before I even talk about it, I'm going to go ahead and put in yes. The reason is simple. You're going to find yes to be really common with examinations. It's pretty rare to have a subject matter that you can't subject to audit level scrutiny. And so yes is going to be a pretty safe answer no matter what they throw at you when talking about the examination level of service. Where it gets a bit more complicated though is we start looking at the other levels of attestation. How about a review? Well, the answer here, and I'm going to circle as we hit no's, the reason being that review really wouldn't provide any meaningful assurance. You see, the whole point of prospective financial statements, if we were to examine them, is to say, well, did they follow the appropriate format? And more importantly, are the assumptions reasonable? Well, how would that work with a review? To say, well, nothing came to our attention to make us think the assumptions were unreasonable? It loses meaning. And so the AICPA basically said, no, we don't want you performing review level service. How about a compilation? Again, I like to use the word translation. So could you see a scenario where a client would say, hey, we want help building a forecast. We know all the assumptions we want to build into it, and we can show those to you. We just don't know quite how to build the actual forecast. Sounds sensible enough to me, and the AICPA would agree with us. They say, yes, you can perform compilation level services. Finally, agreed upon procedures. Well, the answer here is also yes. In fact, when you go through the standards regarding agreed upon procedures, it even calls out prospective financial statements insofar as you have to gain a list of the significant assumptions. All right, let's look at number 2. Now that's pro forma. And I know I always have students that will mix these up because they see the letters PRO in prospective and they see the letters PRO in pro forma and they think, oh, they're basically the same thing, and they're not. Pro forma is taking a set of historical financial statements and tweaking them or adjusting them in some way for some hypothetical event. For example, saying, what if we had bought that company 3 years ago? What might our financial statements look like today? Well, can we do an examination? Again, the answer here is by default going to be yes. Certainly, we can look at that and make sure that the application of that hypothetical change was done appropriately. Could we subject it to a review? The answer here is also yes, because in the same way that a regular set of financial statements can be reviewed, where you say, well, we did some really basic procedures and nothing came to our attention, we can do the same thing here because these are based off of historical financial statements. How about a compilation? Again, does it make sense that a client could say, hey, I need your help. I want to build this set of pro forma statements that my bank asked for. I just don't know how, but I know what the facts are. Again, the answer is yeah, that does make sense. So a compilation is permitted. What about agreed upon procedures? Well, considering a pro forma is a very specific thing. It literally says, take a set of historical financials and change them. What exactly would be the agreed upon procedures beyond that you would ever be asked to do? It just doesn't make sense. So the answer here is no. We would not do an agreed upon procedures engagement for pro forma. How about the third one? That's compliance. So it's providing some sort of attestation as to a client's compliance. Well, we'll go ahead and get the easy one out of the way. That's examination. The answer there is absolutely yes. How about a review? Well, again, it's a question of, does that really provide any value to the reader? Do you feel better if you're asking, well, gee, did they follow the regulations and the laws? And you say, well, nothing came to my attention that tells me they didn't do it. doesn't say a whole lot. So there again, the AICPA went, no, we don't really think that makes sense. Can you help someone translate compliance? No, that doesn't really make sense either. Again, compilations are generally talking about some kind of, hey, I know the facts, I just don't know how to take it and turn it into GAAP speak or some kind of financial statement. How about agreed upon procedures? Well, the answer here is yes, that makes perfect sense, because the client could ask us to perform certain procedures to test their compliance in any number of ways. So that makes more sense. The fourth one, MD&A, that's Management's Discussion and Analysis. What we're focusing on here is, did the client follow the SEC guidelines in terms of preparing and producing that MD&A? So examination, you bet. Like everything else on this list, we can certainly devote audit level or basically audit level scrutiny to that engagement. How about a review? This has often struck me as a little odd. The answer here is also yes. And again, the idea is we're saying, hey, yeah, as far as we can tell, nothing came to our attention that says they didn't follow the SEC rules. Does that provide any value? A little, right? It's not where it's confusing, it's not ambiguous. It's just a much more kind of a cursory examination or cursory test of the data. How about a compilation? Well, no. This isn't translating into some specialized language. MD&A is plain English. It's describing what happened for the company. So a compilation really would make no sense here. And agreed upon procedures doesn't either, because there's really no sense in that. What kind of procedures would you have me do when it's one specific thing? MD&A has particular ingredients. There's really nothing beyond that you'd ever be asked to do. Then we get to the last of these, and that's the service organization. Now, if you remember, service organization audit reports are critically important to the user auditor, right? Depending on the type of the report, whether it's type 1 or type 2. Remember, a type 1 report, all that does is give you information about the controls. It provides no assurance at all. Well, that means that that type 1 wouldn't fall onto this table at all, because reviews provide some level of assurance. It wouldn't make sense to have compilation, and it wouldn't make sense for this to be agreed upon procedures. It's simply a list of what controls are enacted. The other type, the type 2, has to give us that reasonable assurance in order to rely on those internal controls at the service organization. So you can take this one a little bit differently and say, well, if I want to create a type 2, I've got to be up here. So that's the only level that makes sense. So if we've disqualified the rest for type 1, and we've established that type 2 has to be an examination, you know what the answer to the rest of them have to be. No, because a review would not be sufficient. No, because a compilation, and no, because an agreed upon procedures. Neither of those really makes any sense. Now, one last point to remember. With any table like this, don't get hung up on every individual block. Remember, the more of these you populate correctly, the more you're adding to your score. So knock out the ones you're more sure of. Don't agonize over the ones you're not. And then if all else fails, do what I did here. Apply common sense. Would it be logical to do that at that level of assurance or that level of performance? So hopefully that helps clear that up and can help you as you work on a practical exercise.